Warning, this video will have spoilers for Fear and Hunger. Happy Halloween, everyone. The Dungeon of Fear and Hunger, even though it's not the worst place in fiction, it's still a really dark and fucked up place. As soon as you step into the dungeon, your mind and hunger gets drained unnaturally fast. There's monsters which want to either kill you or put you through the worst suffering imaginable. And if that's not bad enough, there's new gods and even Grogroth, who could kill you, which is way deeper in the dungeon, if everything else hasn't killed you already. We can all agree that the average Joe and most protagonists from certain games or shows wouldn't even stand a chance against everything within the first few levels of the dungeon. However, there are some characters who could potentially go through the whole dungeon no problem, or at least handle themselves well enough to survive for a while. Therefore, we're going to be discussing how certain characters from other games or shows would be able to handle being sent into the dungeon. I'm not going to go for the whole mental gymnastics of explaining how each character ends up in this time period, and how they get to the dungeon and all that. But let's just say they end up going there for the same reason as most Fear and Hunger protagonists, to save the guard, have him tell the protagonist there's something greater deep in the dungeon, and going deeper in the dungeon because of that. I will, however, only focus on horror characters, medieval characters, or medieval fantasy characters, since, well, putting Master Chief and Doom Guy in the dungeon doesn't really seem fitting at all. And I'll also be taking their abilities and skills into account for their survivability, and assuming they'll come in with their own arsenal of weapons. One final disclaimer. Although I've put time into doing research into most of the information and abilities these characters have, I don't have 100% knowledge of every single character in this video. Therefore, if I do miss out on a potential ability that could increase their survivability drastically, or underestimate a character or anything, feel free to let me know in the comments. Also, I'm not going to mention the new god ending because, well, all these characters probably would be fucked if they went into the void regardless of their strength. Anyway, without further ado, let's get right into it, with a very great contender for the dungeons, Guts from Berserk. Guts has grown up and lived through an extremely harsh medieval world, similar to the one in Fear and Hunger, and also has many similarities with Ragnvaldr in terms of a rough upbringing in childhood, and hatred towards a certain man with long hair later on in the story. Although he went through a lot of traumatic shit, the worst thing he went through was probably the Eclipse, and despite losing an arm and an eye, in an attempt to stop Griffith from violating Casca, his rage and desire for revenge basically turned him into Japanese Doomslayer, killing a fuck ton of demons and stronger apostles with his Dragon Slayer, which is like a 10-foot long fucking sword, in order to chase after Griffith and kill him. He also has a prosthetic arm to replace his now lost arm, which has a fucking cannon inside of it, which can be fired. And on top of that, he also has the Berserk armor, which is fucking insane in of itself. It gives him an insane sense for bloodlust, speeds him up heavily, holds his arms and legs and all that in place, even if his bones are broken, eliminates any self-preservation instincts, so he wouldn't feel fear, and so many other things which would turn him into a fucking powerhouse. With all his past feats and experience, he'd have a very easy time dealing with, well, almost anything in the dungeon. There's only two problems I see with this, though. One problem is, even though it's a smaller one, is that he wouldn't really be able to use his sword within the mines or the dungeon, due to how small the tunnels are and shit. But even then, he can still use his cannon arm to kill certain enemies, so I don't think that would be too much of a problem. I can also see him doing what Ragnvaldr does in his S ending, which is killing every boss enemy, but takes it to an even bigger extreme and killing every monster in the dungeon. Probably the god as well. As soon as he realizes the god is trying to become a new god and shit, since he dealt with that shit with Griffith before, he'd probably kill him before he could become a new god. The other massive problem though is Grogroth. Although Guts has defeated many strong apostles and can potentially defeat the new gods very easily too, he hasn't actually ever slain anything with the power of a god before. He could definitely defeat the traces of Grogroth with a rough fight, and could potentially even handle seeing Grogroth's true form with his Berserker armor. However, I can imagine his sanity still decreasing heavily, and as he keeps trying to fight Golgoth, he'll eventually run out of steam and die. So I'd say he makes it pretty damn far. Even with him dying deep inside the gauntlet, he would still definitely take the entirety of the dungeon with him. So I'd probably rank his survivability a 9 out of 10. With the only real threat towards him being Golgoth. And that's assuming he even discovers the gauntlet after slaying everything in the dungeon in Mahabre. The next character is a rather well-known and loved horror character, being Leon Kennedy. Leon has dealt with a lot of shit. In the first game he's in, he is a cop in Raccoon City. He's literally only a rookie too, so he's new to the job. He had to kill a bunch of zombies, William Birkin, who ends up mutating or some shit, and actively avoiding Mr. X, and getting out of the city before it got nuked. That in itself is pretty impressive. But in other Resident Evil media later on, it shows that he's not only more brave against going against the undead, and whatever else he gets into, but in fact gets way more stronger and experienced. However, since the Dungeon of Fear and Hunger is in the 15th century, his pistol ammo will be greatly limited, so eventually he would have to rely on taking out enemies with melee weapons, which, although he's been able to take out villagers and zombies up close to feeds, I don't know how well he's gonna do against something bigger and stronger like a god. But let's just say that his years of combat experience gives him an upper hand, and the fact he can get a sword fairly early on in the game, before coming across any guards, along with his agility as well, he'd be able to very easily dodge, attack, and kill guards, which is great. But what about the stronger enemies within the first few levels? I can see him potentially handling elite guards, or possibly even the Cave Mother and Salvenstake on his own, but I don't see him being able to defeat the Crow Mauler, or most other stronger enemies down the line. He's definitely strong, but without firearms. He's only as strong as all the other protagonists in Fear and Hunger, I feel. Therefore, I'm going to rank his survivability at 4 out of 10. He can go toe-to-toe with guards and most early enemies, but would struggle heavily against the strong enemies deep in the dungeon. Next up is a character who I thought would be interesting to talk about surviving in Fear and Hunger, and there's a whole reason why I decided to make this video. And that would be Ezio Auditore from Assassin's Creed 2. Now, we all know that Assassin's Creed hasn't been that good in a while, especially with the recent Assassin's Creed games like Assassin's Creed Shadow and all the other controversies and shit surrounding that, but Ezio's easily the GOAT of the series, hence why he has 3 fucking games about him. He grew up during the Renaissance, had most of his family executed, and ends up devoting his life to becoming an assassin to get revenge against the Templars for his family, and also get a piece of Eden and so on. Now, a few reasons why I felt he'd be interesting for the dungeon. First of all, he has had similar experience of diving into dungeons with the Assassin's Tomes. Even if there's not any horrific monsters or anything there, apart from some Templars, I feel that he gives him plenty of experience with dungeon diving and all of that, so yeah. Second off, he's a master at stealth and able to move and parkour super fast, if he needs to get away from certain enemies. I don't see him being able to use his parkour much in the early levels due to how small and cramped it is, but he is incredible at stealth. So I feel like he'd not only be able to get the drop on most enemies, but avoid stronger enemies as well, such as the Crow Mauler. Even if he gets caught, he has smoke bombs, which can deteriorate the enemies and allow him to escape. When he arrives in Mahabre though, I can imagine him being able to avoid most enemies simply by parkouring around. Thirdly as well, he's a really good fighter. If you overlook Assassin's Creed's pretty lame enemy logic of only attacking you one at a time, it's implied that he's able to take on multiple armed enemies at once, including armored enemies with axes and shit. And he's also pretty agile too, making it so he can avoid or counter most attacks. Lastly, he has eagle vision, which can help him detect loot and enemies even in the dark, which is always helpful since the dungeons are pitch fucking black if you have no torches in terror and starvation. I feel he could definitely make it to Mahabre, and possibly even help Legarde with reaching the throne. I have no clue how he would go toe to toe with any of the new gods though. He can definitely go against most enemies very easily, and stealth past the harder challenges, but he'd definitely have a hard time going against Voltaire, the Tormented One, Scan Granny, and Francois, so I feel like he's gonna die from one of the new gods. So I'd honestly rank his survivability at like 7 out of 10. He's able to fare very well against most mortal enemies, but yeah, he'd have a hard time against the new gods. And now onto someone who is least likely to survive the dungeon. John Ward. John is a priest who has been through many horrifying experiences and has relied only on his faith in Jesus to keep him safe and defeat each demon he comes across. And even then, it's difficult and unreliable at times to rely on. John Ward is also pretty slow, even in situations where a fast or horrifying demon is chasing after him. He can only walk slowly and calmly, which, credit where credit is due, that's chat as fuck. However, him relying on his faith and his cross, and faith in Jesus and all that, that's not going to help much when he's face to face with a god. Therefore, his survivability is going to be at 1 in 10, as he'd probably die very early on. Last, but definitely not least, is the Dragonborn from Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. He's pretty damn strong. You can get some strong ass weapons like Maroon's Razor, which has a chance to one-shot Alduin and the other strong ass bosses, and access to magic, which is also strong, but in lore, Dragonborns are fucking OP. In the DLC, he is able to fight and defeat the first Dragonborn, known as Miraak, who is strong enough to not only defeat dragons, but potentially even defeat godlike beings. At the peak of the last Dragonborn's strength, he's able to take down dragons with the Dragonrent shout, cause massive storms with his shout, and can strike nearby enemies with thunder, or even just simply knock enemies off onto their asses with the infamous Fus Ro Dah. So I have a feeling that the Dragonborn would be able to surpass Guts. He'd probably help the god ascend to godhood rather than kill him, or just kill him for shits and gigs. He'd defeat the new gods, every enemy on the upper layers, and potentially even kill the traces of Grogoth in the gauntlet. I also think the Dragonborn would be able to see Grogoth's true form without dying from fear or whatever the hell happens, because he's able to look at the Elder Scroll as many times as he wants without either going blind or going completely mad, allowing him to loot the dungeon to his heart's content and leave with his life. Therefore, I'm giving the Dragonborn a survivability rating of 10 out of 10. Anyway, that's all for this video. Hope you enjoy your fucking Halloween, and yeah, later, cuts.